Good day to you, Maurizio. Welcome once again for the Advocata Conversation. What brings you to Sri Lanka?
Oh, thank you very much, Murtaza. It brings me to Sri Lanka the dissemination of a new report. As every 6 months, more or less, we produce these South Asia development updates. And the most recent one, which was actually launched yesterday, is called Women, Jobs and Growth.
So, for the benefit of our audience, what role do you play in the World Bank?
Yes, I have been at the World Bank for close to 21 years. And in my last 4 or 5, I've been the Deputy Chief Economist for South Asia. The World Bank is organized in regions, and in each region we have a Chief Economist Office, and I have been working there for 5 years.
Mm-hmm. So South Asia probably represents something like 25% of humanity, and since about 20 years ago, they have decided to develop themselves. Of course, the headlines are full of how well India is doing, and the Indian stock market has hit record levels and a massive amount of wealth creation. There has been a benefit to the peripheral countries also. So what are the key findings of your report?
Okay, so yes, indeed, as you said, in the last 3 decades, the region has achieved stunning development. India, but not only India, of course. What we do in this report is not looking at really the long term, but more the short term. And the report has most of these every 6 months focus on the macroeconomic situation and the outlook. And surprisingly, the outlook is quite positive. Surprisingly, because it's even more positive than what we predicted 6 months ago. So the region as a whole will grow at about 6.4% in 2024, and then 6.2 and 6.2 for the 2 following years. And the positive surprise is that across the board in South Asia, we have the group is 7-8 countries, and for all these countries, no, actually for the majority of these countries, we have an upgrade. The only 2 countries for which we have no upgrade or a slight downgrade are Bangladesh and Maldives. But for Maldives is actually not really a downgrade, but rather there are some delays in the construction of a big airport. Since 25% of the GDP in Maldives is tourism, that is an important investment and has been delayed a little bit. So more than a downgrade is a shifting 0.5% of growth from 2025 to 2026. For Bangladesh, the issue is more that the political uncertainty that came about from the social unrest, the recent social unrest, and the flooding in the agriculture will delay agriculture production. For all the other countries, including Sri Lanka, we have a fairly positive, for some quite significant upgrades. Now, this makes the region as a whole for almost the last 10 years, South Asia region, the region that grows fastest in the world. So it overcame in 2020 East Asian Pacific and the China group, and so it's interesting to see that the region is doing very well. Now, in the report we also say that these forecasts will materialize if no issue, if there is no downside issue materializing. So there are some risks to this forecast. Among them, we have been emphasizing this for a while, but we emphasize climate change, policy slippage, the razor-thin space that countries, the government have in terms of absorbing shock because of the high level of debt, social unrest, and the like. So, but and that's the other big messages that come out of the report. There are also untapped potential in the region. So even if it's already growing at a very fast pace, it could grow even more if these untapped potentials are taken on board. And we see two. The first one, which we probably will talk more later, is the fact that only 1/3 of the working age women are participating region-wide in the market. And so it's a very, very low proportion of women that actively participate in the labor market. And the second one is the trade openness opportunity of integrating more the economies of South Asia with the world. So these are the main messages. The region is doing great. There are some downsides, risks to that, but there is also untapped potential that it could go even better in the near future.
Before we explore that, I noted that Sri Lanka had a significant upgrade since April.
Yes.
Was the investment outlook one of the key drivers?
Yes, there is. Let me mention that our local team here in Sri Lanka has also launched yesterday, together with the regional update, a Sri Lanka development update. And I invite your audience to also look into that, and they go in much more detail about the situation in Sri Lanka. But indeed, we talk about the investment being an upside surprise. So there has been an uptick in investment expenditure both on the public and private side. But they also expand this and discuss that the whole normalization of the economic situation has come to fruition. There has been increase in also private consumption. The price inflation has stabilized. In fact, just recently we were discussing this. There has been some sign of even deflation, negative price changes, but it's probably a marginal issue that has allowed, obviously, the policy rates to come down, which facilitate investment. There was an interesting statistics on construction activity. They were tracking the consumption of cement across the whole year, and they show that in 2024 it's well above 2022 clearly, but still not pre-crisis level. So construction is picking up, but not as much as pre-crisis. And as we do in our report, their Sri Lanka specific report focus a lot on untapped potential of trade. An interesting statistic that they mentioned is that they did some calculation that up to $10 billion is left on the table of potential exports for the region, for the country. So it's a lot of money that can come in the country if Sri Lanka opens up to more trade.
An interesting another outcome in your report also is the link between exports and women employment, which we will explore. But before we go on to the untapped potential, would you want to comment a little bit about the growth in India? Is that going to be sustained at these very, very high levels?
So we distinguish the regional growth with and without India, and India clearly is that's the lion part of the region. The government has interesting plans for the future. We have asked ourselves the same question: is this something cyclical, this boom, or can be sustained? Now, the answer is that for the short term, clearly the uptake comes from consumption, and it may be cyclical, but the economy looks strong. There's an interesting quote that Jean Dries and Amartya Sen had in their 2013 book, An Uncertain Glory was called, that they were depicting India as a few islands of California in an ocean of sub-Saharan Africa. But in fact, while we also see a little bit of some isolated spots of high level of potential, high level of productivity, and some others that are not there, these islands of California are expanding, and so there is still many structural issues to be overcome. One being female labor force participation, but it's moving in the right direction overall. That's my assessment.
So you mentioned about untapped potential.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit about the first untapped potential?
Let's talk first about the trade, perhaps, and then female labor force participation. So, okay, the context for the untapped potential in terms of integrating more with the global economy comes from an observation that is not just specific to South Asia, but has been talked about by Latin American economists, for example, another region, and that starts off perhaps even before COVID, but COVID accelerated this, from the observation that countries have been trading more intensively with other politically aligned countries or friendly countries. So measuring this is not simple. But there is research, and we did some of that for this report, that is calculating the geo-economic fragmentation of the global economy, global trade, FDI, and other international flows. And the way to do that is to look at the voting in the UN General Assembly. And basically, you can sort of divide the world between two groups: those who have voting that is more aligned towards China, and voting that is more aligned towards the US. And when you do that, you broadly find two groups: the emerging markets, developing economies that are more aligned with the distribution around that, but more aligned towards China, and the rich, advanced economies that are more aligned around the US. When it comes to South Asia, all the 7 countries, with a little bit of an exception for Sri Lanka, in fact, they don't seem aligned. They seem in the middle. So they're neither aligned with China nor aligned with the US. So that's a potential opportunity because they can trade with both blocks and therefore take advantage of both opportunities in growth opportunities in either of the blocks. And in fact, what we can add to that is the diversification of export destination and FDI sources for South Asia is also fairly diversified. It's not so aligned politically either. And so with these two present an opportunity for the region. The issue is that, which is similar to Latin America, which is much more aligned with the US, the issue is that there hasn't been much openness in the region. And Latin America is much more open, but the direction has been towards going down, and so the trend is not positive. For the South Asia is more the level. And
I think you say in the report that South Asia is one of the least open
correct.
regions.
Yes. So if you look at both export and import flows, it's way within the 25% least open group of countries. Similarly on FDI. So there is a whole 75% of the distribution that can go up. The only interesting exception is on remittances. In that sense, the region is among the most open, and in terms of receiving remittances, some of the countries, Pakistan specifically, but Sri Lanka is also
very high.
receiving a lot of
about I think 7% of GDP.
Correct.
Gross remittances. Yes. We have some outflows also.
Right. So now. To conclude on the untapped potential of globalization and integration in terms of goods market and financial flows, indeed, the situation, the geopolitical fragmentation is not a problem for South Asia because South Asia can trade with both blocks. The only issue is that they should trade and they should integrate more and develop more that openness, which, an important point that we should emphasize, is not by chance that it happened that they are not open. If you look at the trade policy, if you look at the financial flows, control, and regulations, there are a lot of policies that are behind the fact that these countries are not so integrated. And so there is policy lever that can be changed to reach that level of integration. Sri Lanka, let me say one word about Sri Lanka. If you look at the tariff, the average tariff is among the best in terms of openness. It has the lowest applied tariff in the region. However, there is a lot of non-tariff barriers in Sri Lanka that are still creating barriers to this. In the Sri Lanka Development Update, they look into details of that. They also look at not only at the nominal level of protection with the tariff, but the effective rate of protection, the fact that a lot of intermediate goods have high tariff, and that creates issues for competitiveness of firms that needs imported inputs. So there is discussion there in their report, and so yes, there are policy levers that the countries can use to achieve opening more and take advantage of that potential.
Just to give some context to our audience also, and also to you, Maurizio,
yes,
is that although we score fairly well in terms of low tariffs, we have something of our own innovation here called para-tariffs.
Yes.
Something called the Commodity Export Subsidy Scheme, which is called CES. And as the name specifies, it was initially thought of raising some kind of development funding for non-value added exports. We historically had tea, coconut, and rubber.
Right.
But somewhere down the road, about 20 years ago, the CES transitioned from the export side to the import side. And as you know, in the WTO framework, these are not tariffs, but called para-tariffs. And where we have signed free trade or partial trade agreements with countries, we are using these para-tariffs to give protection. And sometimes when you add that cess and there is something else called Port Authority Levy, we call it PAL,
Right.
it's very high. The border taxes are very high. And what happens is, in terms of the effective tariff protection, that many of our industries probably add about 30%. And if you have border taxes as high as 60%, you are giving effective tariff protection of something like 200%.
Correct. Yes.
And then we have huge issues that there is a misunderstanding in this country that you can promote domestic industries at the same time you can export. As you know, the two don't go together. But because unless you can source very competitively, you're never going to be competitive in your exporting.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There was another point also. I don't know whether you had come about that there is a very low level of intra-regional trade. You want to comment about that?
Yes.
I think the figure was like 5% once upon a time.
Yes. Correct. Yes. Well, if we look at the integration in many of the developing country blocks, being these Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asian Pacific or South Asia, they tend to not trade with each other that much within the regions. Partly the explanation is that they specialize on similar things, so they don't need to trade between each other. But in the case of South Asia, is particularly low. This intra regional trade, and that is potentially an issue because exporting outside the group it means exposing yourself to a degree of competition that is really high. Being able to export to the U.S., to Europe, or other regions tend to be more competitive, and at times developing a local trade activity can be helpful. In another interesting issue is that you see for certain sector there is a bit more of intra regional trade, and that is for example for specialized industrial good. If you look at firms like Tata, for example, conglomerates like Tata, or electric cars in other regions, etc. So there are areas where initially tapping onto a larger local market can help develop a technology, test the market, etc. before you export around the world. So the whole success of Europe is one of intra-regional trade, and so it operates at a level of income much higher than here. But there is somehow also an untapped potential of pushing up these intra-regional trade. Now, a simple example is that we have a hub serving Asia, and we couldn't place it in for our office. We couldn't place it in South Asia because of just simply logistic of the connection, airline connection. So it ended up being in Bangkok, in Thailand, because it's easier to travel from Bangkok to any countries in South Asia than from any country in South Asia to another country in South Asia. We thought about, I think initially there was an idea of having it in Colombo, but I think in Colombo you can travel most places, but not Bhutan perhaps, yes. Or something like that. But if you think of the big countries, India, you can't travel to Pakistan or vice versa. So there are these end up being impediments to develop the intra-regional trade.
You also in the report you looked at flows. And I think they mentioned that in terms of exports and in terms of investment flows, portfolio on FDI, the flows are quite weak.
Yes.
But remittances are very strong.
Right.
And then you also discuss the pros and cons of remittances.
Yes.
Would you like to touch on that?
Of course, yes. So yes, we had quite a debate, an internal debate, when we were looking at these numbers, and the debate was that how do we figure out where the causality goes? Is it because remittances are so high and they produce all these real exchange rate appreciation, deindustrialization, negative impact on even labor supply? That's the problem. Or we should look at the fact that, okay, so these countries have fewer opportunities. Some of these countries have fewer opportunities for non-agricultural jobs, that people with initiative, they tend to find the employment outside of the region. And so it's more the initial conditions that are the root problem rather than the remittances. So what we end up saying in the report is a kind of a compromise to that. So indeed, there are some issues in the labor markets of many of these countries, whereby people who have opportunities outside, rather because they have already some relative or know someone that has found jobs elsewhere that pay well, they emigrate and then start sending remittances. And these remittances are really helpful. There's a large literature on the advantages for households that are recipient of remittances, because they can supplement their consumption. They can invest in education of their children, and so there are many positive aspects of remittances. But from the macro side, there are this difficulty of managing the real exchange appreciation. So because of the flows and the transformation of these flows into consumption of non-tradable mainly, the real exchange rate appreciates, and that creates pressure of structural adjustment in the direction that is not helpful for growth, because non-tradables are less productive in general than tradables, and so the economies lose their export edge. Investment tend to be also less buoyant when there are all these inflows, and so more than a negative causation from remittances to
unintended consequences.
There are these policy challenges, how to manage that. And they are similar in a way, if you think of this, they're similar to challenges that countries that have boom in a commodity, they're exporting gold or exporting tea, etc. When the price of oil, when the price goes up, a lot of inflows come in, and there are these issues. So the policy, few countries have been able to manage these very well. Either commodity booms or remittances boom, and what countries can do is really to try to develop as much as they can their local productivity. So maintain an edge on competitiveness even when the exchange rate is appreciating. And one way to do that was, I think, experimented initially in Jamaica, another island, was to shift a little bit of the tax policies from, say, payroll taxation that punishes even more the labor supply or the cost of labor to consumption. So in a way, you help adjust the negative impact with some shift of the taxes. Now, it's not something I can immediately translate for Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka reliance of indirect taxation is already very high, and so taxing even more consumption may be problematic. But it's something that there has been example where the impact of remittances can be counterbalanced by some tax adjustment. So that's one thing that we discuss in.
But you also discussed that there are some benefits for remittances, right?
Yes.
Certainly at the household level.
Of course, yes. Well, yeah, the
education, health.
The household, the recipient are obviously insulated in a way, are insulated from domestic shocks, because they, in fact, it can be counter cyclical, the remittances. When there is a problem at home, people that are working outside, relatives that work outside, they know about this. They can even raise the level of remittances. So there is an insurance mechanism through remittances that is very, very important. A lot of remittances recipients tend to be among the non-poor. So at the micro level, at the household level, remittances have very many positive impact indeed.
In fact, to give you some context, when Sri Lanka went through the crisis, there was a record number of people who left the country for overseas employment, many of them temporary. There was some who went for permanent migration. And we are having a significant appreciation in the Sri Lankan rupee, which was unexpected. Yes, and it is because of elevated levels of remittances that have been coming in the last few months, right, with the change of government and expectations high. Right. So that has really played out in Sri Lanka. It is estimated like between 1 to 10 or 1 in 8 households have remittances. Mm-hmm. So you were also a principal author of Chapter 2.
Yes.
What's Chapter 2 about?
Okay, so Chapter 2 is about female labor force participation, and it's a little bit the culmination of a 5 years or so research program on gender inequality. When you look at South Asia as a region, the topic of inequality is not at the center of the attention as much as, say, in Latin America. The Gini levels, the inequality index that we economists use to measure inequality of the distribution of income, is been going up in the region, but it's not in level terms as high as in other region. But there is a particular type of inequality that is concerning in the region, and that is what economists call inequality of opportunity, which is the share of inequality that can be explained by circumstances that are beyond the control of the individual. So even if you have a lukewarm level of overall inequality in the distribution of, say, income or consumption, if that level of inequality is explained by the fact that you belong to a certain caste or belong to a certain ethnic group, or especially in this case, you are a woman versus a man, then that type of inequality is very unfair and very morally unacceptable, let's put it this way. But not only is unfair and morally unacceptable, it has also an efficiency cost, because the people belonging to certain groups that are at the bottom of the distribution, or they have less opportunity, they naturally invest less in their human capital, or they're not allocated in the economy in an efficient manner. So this type of inequality, as I said, even if it's not very high, when it's very unfair, it has costs, high cost in terms of efficiency and of equity. And in a way, although we don't do this in this report, a lot of the social unrest that is happening in this region, but also elsewhere, also in Europe, also in the US, is partially can be connected to this unfairness of inequality. So, but the focus, as I said,
that unfairness is unfairness of opportunities.
Yes, the fact that your position in the distribution is not dependent on your effort or things or that you control. It's dependent on the fact that you are born brown, or you're born a woman, or you're born from parents of a certain level of education, etc. So another way of looking at it, there's a whole branch in the literature on intergenerational mobility. The fact that your position as a generation is dependent or not on where the position of your parents. If you are born from rich parents, you'll be rich, or if you're born from poor parents, you will be poor. That's a society with very low intergenerational mobility.
I think somebody in the US wrote a book about this.
Well, Chetty has been writing about the fact that
this is Raj Chetty.
Raj Chetty, yes, has been writing about this for quite some time. The American dream is broken, and it shows indeed that there have been a transformation of the mobility from the 60s, 50s, 40s to the 70s, 80s, 90s. Now, if you compare these two generations, most generation in the past were able to overcome their parents very easily in terms of both absolute position, so because of growth, but also in terms of relative position. So if they were born from a parents that were in the low part of the distribution, they were able to jump above. That is gone. Now it's not the mobility, intergenerational mobility is very low in the US. We did some calculation, again not in this report, but we did some calculation for South Asia, and also South Asia is one of the worst region in terms of intergenerational mobility. So this to say that it's a culmination, but the focus of the chapter is on a specific issue and on gender, and specifically on women participation in the labor market. The chapter starts from the observation that only a third of women, as I mentioned, only a third of women are participating in the labor market, And that is at the lowest level, close to Middle East and North Africa. And it's below, it's in the bottom quartile. On average, developing countries, female participation is about 55%. And men in South Asia are at 77%. So interestingly, this problem is not going away.
So this participation, how is it measured?
Okay, so it's measured in, it's fairly simple. You look at the population, then you identify the working age population, which is between 15 and 65. And those are, that's the part of the population that is working age, eligible to
economically
work,
active.
Economically active. And then you take the proportion of that is actually actively participating or having a job or looking for a job. Now, unemployment is a very low statistics in most developing countries. People have to work, so there is not much unemployment. But there is then a group that doesn't participate at all. It doesn't look for a job or is not actively employed. And that is 66% of women. It's a huge number, and that is we emphasize this, and I'm proud of this fact that even on the first page of the report, we say gender inequality has become macro critical. So if the region wants to reach this ambitious goal of becoming a middle income or high income country in a generation or a little beyond that, and then having 1/3 of half of its population not active is a little bit inconsistent with those ambitions. So a macro publication that now talks about gender inequality as a macro issue is quite relevant and quite an interesting achievement for people like me that have been working on gender inequality for a while.
So I think the approach that you took was you looked at demand side factors and supply side factors.
Yes.
Can you elaborate the demand side factors for us?
Sure. Let me say, before going there, I want to mention one more thing on the potential. And that is, again, to motivate policymaker to pay careful attention to this. We do some calculation that are a bit of a thought experiment, because obviously female labor force participation is not a variable under control of the policymaker. But the thought experiment is as follows: if we were able to bring female labor force participation at the par of male labor force participation, so increasing from, as I said, about 1/3 to 2/3, 77%, or even above, almost 3/4, the impact on GDP would be enormous. And we do some simulation to calculate that. Those are not simple exercises, but we did them using various types of macroeconomic models. The range goes from 13% to 51%. So it's up to 50% of GDP can be increased if women participate. And the range, the variation in the range is large because it depends on essentially two things. One is whether additional capital is available for the additional women that enter the market, and two, whether women are able to enter all types of jobs, also productive jobs, and not just the jobs that currently they hold, which tend to be in not so productive sectors. So the potential is there, and it's very large. So that's what I wanted to mention. Going to your question on on the demand side and the supply side. Okay, so why is that the women don't participate as much as they could or maybe even should? So to figure this out, a usual framework is to look at these various parts. On the demand side, the story is as follows. Economies, as they developed, they transformed themselves from more agriculture to more manufacturing and towards then services. And in the meantime, they become also more urbanized, and they tend to be also more open to trade. Now,
and also services, the structural.
Yes, towards services indeed, yes. Yeah. Now, this structural transformation, we have looked at that at the global level, and what we observe is that indeed countries move along these trends towards services, towards urbanization, towards more opening, and all of these structural transformation create demand for more women working. And but interestingly, when we looked at South Asia and specifically, these transformations first, they haven't happened at the same pace as in other regions of the world. So, for example, urbanization has increased, but from a very, very low base in South Asia, but not as much as in other regions. The transformation towards services has happened, but again, not as much as in other regions. But more interestingly, the impact on women demand has not been so strong. So there hasn't been an increase in participation as observed in the other parts of the world. So the demand doesn't seem to exert the same impact on female labor participation as in other parts of the world. Why? But we need to qualify that, because when you look at prices or wages rather, indeed, wages for women in services vis-a-vis manufacturing or especially agriculture are closer to the men than in these other sectors. So the pressure, the market signal is there. So the demand seems to be there because it increases the price, the wages, but there must be some other obstacle that even if the opportunity are created, they are not taken, and that is we need to go to look at the supply side.
So coming back to the demand, let's the services.
Yes.
Now the argument is that you don't need brawn to be in services like manufacturing. You don't need physical strength.
Yes.
And therefore, that's the reason, one of the reasons why you have more women in services. Am I correct?
Yes. There's that. That is one way of looking at the story. Another way of looking at the story is more at the micro level is the income versus substitution effect. The idea being that at low level of development, more agriculture-based level of development, the incomes of the households are very low. And so as soon as the economy developed and moved towards manufacturing, the income goes up. And there is an income effect that women can consume more leisure, say, they consume more, occupying their time with other activities, taking care of the kids, etc. Then when the development keep going and opportunities arise in services where the wages start being higher than in manufacturing or agriculture, then the substitution effect kicks in, and the relative price of leisure versus having a good job that pays well kicks in, and then women go back and enter the services sectors. So that's the other mechanism, that
It's
there's a kind of a U-curve
U-curve,
kind
right.
of effect, where in the down part of the U, the income effect prevails, and then in the upward part of the curve is the substitution effect, that the price effect or the wage effect that takes over.
So let me summarize that. In services, what you're saying is that the wage differential between men and women are quite small, basically. So that does not explain why women are not in services. There are two other demand drivers. Urbanization. How does urbanization drive demand for women in the labor force?
Well, okay, so it's linked to two things potentially. One, but we're going a little bit towards the supply side as well. But one is that urban centers tend to have less stringent social norms. People are more anonymous. You don't know which group they belong, what kind of behavior they should hold, and so there is a little more freedom from social expectation on how to behave and whether you should go out and work. So that's one thing that helps women participate more. The second is that there's usually better services of education, so people get the skill levels are a little higher in urban areas, and the premium, indeed, we measure that the premium for education is higher for women getting education is higher in urban areas than in rural areas. So because of that, of those reasons, there is more demand for women in.
And I think I read somewhere in the report also that women who are better educated actually participate more in the labor force, right?
Well, yes, yes, but not as much as you would wish, because if you look at the labor force participation broadly, even controlling for education. There is, and that's the conundrum. There is actually higher female labor participation in rural areas than in urban areas, and the way we rationalize that is that there is something that overrides the market signals, and those are the social norms. Bear in mind, I just said that social norms are looser in urban areas than in rural areas, and that's true. By the way, measuring social norms is in its infancy, so there are very few good surveys that do that. Most surveys measure attitudes, but they don't measure the second order belief, which is they measure what do you think is the right behavior, but they don't measure what do I think others think is the right behavior. So even with imperfect data, we are able to measure social norms in rural and urban areas, and indeed in urban areas they are looser. However, because of the structure of the market in urban areas versus rural areas, the labor market, the challenge to the social norm is higher in urban areas than in rural areas. What I mean by that is that in rural areas, most women that participate work from home or from within the farm, or they are helpers. So they are still not going out and being employed by a stranger or go to an office where the husband doesn't know what's happening, etc. In urban areas, the labor market is different. The labor market means that if you want a job, you have to go out of your house and participate in an office or in a factory, etc. So the challenge of going out for work is more present in a way in urban areas than in rural areas. So that's what all these pieces are help explain this conundrum of there are the right market signals, but there is less participation.
And the third demand driver was exports.
Yes, correct.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, yes. That's the only exception of where South Asia belongs as the rest of the world, and which is when a sector or a firm is oriented towards tradables or specifically exportables, they tend to discriminate less against women. And indeed, the export-oriented sector tend to employ twice as much as non-tradable sectors. So there is a lot of demand for women in these sectors. There are various reasons, but the most plausible one is that is the competition level. So if you are a firm that wants to compete in the global markets, you need to be efficient, you need to keep your cost down, and women with the same skill, the same productivity as men are still paid 60-70% less than men. So if you wanna take advantage of this cost reduction, you employ more women, especially if women are able to do the same jobs as men. And so because of that, there is this premium for women employment in exportable sector. And that it links back to our first point that the two untapped potential are linked. So if you take advantage of your exposure to the global markets, you will also use up more of your women, and so it's a double dividend in a way.
Labor-intensive manufacturing, like apparel industry, which is very large in Bangladesh, and we have a sizable.
Right.
Those are jobs that men can't do because of the nimble fingers and.
Yes, but I wouldn't go necessarily there to distinguish jobs that are for men and for women. We want the region to have good jobs for everyone, and while it's true that in certain cases there was a very interesting study. I don't know if it was Esther Duflo or someone of our group that were looking at tea pickers in India and the Darjeeling region, because the very high premium tea leaves are small, so you need small hands. But I wouldn't go there. And we are careful in the report. We think that women can do almost the same jobs as men everywhere, and also if they have preference for certain jobs, they tend also to be social norms related preference, but not the true preferences. So it's mostly the discrimination and competition level that if we are able to inject more competition, firms will overcome this idea that women may stay, their attachment to the labor market is not so strong, then they want to have kids, and then they have to take care of the kids, etc. And so it's that can go away.
As an aside, in your research, I mean, I read in the Economist magazine, Maurizio, that Vietnam has a very high female labor participation rate, like 80%. But it's also a massive export champion. I mean, its growth has been driven by a huge expansion in exports. Did you come across anything about the very high participation in Vietnam and its export industries?
I haven't looked at Vietnam specifically. What I did a few years back was a study on Central America. We studied the export processing zones for a few countries in Central America, and what we observed was exactly the same. That when you look at a firm inside an export processing zone, a firm that is focused on exporting, they tend to have lower level of wage gap between men and women and more female participation than firms that are also potentially exporting but outside that processing zone. So it seems fairly convincing to me that this competition discipline and efficiency discipline that brings competing for export to the fact that you want to take advantage of your women and their productivity, their potential, and so you employ more of them.
Now, you also looked at the supply side.
Yes.
And I believe there are about three factors, right, that drive on the supply side. So what were your findings?
Yes. Okay. So there are maybe two groups, perhaps. One being the let's begin with maybe the education side. So obviously, if men have a comparative advantage because they are more productive, because they are more educated, then it's natural that they are employed more than women. But when we look at that, and you find that the gaps in terms of education, primary and for most countries also secondary, are disappearing between men and women. And if you look at the high-income countries, those are also, in fact, graduation in tertiary education is higher now for women than for men. So education doesn't seem to be a key issue. There are some exceptions, Afghanistan and some other areas of the region that some more education would be good, but it doesn't seem to be a problem. Fertility has come down as well in most of the region, so it doesn't seem to be that an issue either. But then we move towards two other areas. One is the care economy, the fact that the provision of childcare in the region is one of the lowest of the world. So it's basically all the care burden is on women, and it's not that women are in a way idle. Therefore, in this region, they are doing a service to the society by taking care of the kids. But it's a bit unbalanced, and it's not clear that they are necessarily better than men, or if there was more equality in that, it would be probably good. And now providing more childcare would be potentially removing a barrier on the supply side. And also one interesting finding from some literature from other parts of the world is that this care economy is also a big employer of women. Okay, so health sector, nursing, primary or preschool care is a lot of time run by women. So those are important issue. But then there is another area that we go quite deeply, and that is what I mentioned earlier, the social norms, culture, attitudes towards working outside for wage, and the legislation framework of the institution of the countries. On this latter, what we do is we use the Women, Business and the Law, which is this data set that has been produced by the World Bank for almost 20 years now, I think, and which measures the de jure laws to protect the rights of women to basically they are in various parts of their activity, from the rights to mobility, having documents to travel, etc., to rights to divorce laws, the division of inheritance, the division of labor at home, the participation in voting, etc. So there's a spectrum of areas where the women businesses and laws looks at whether men and women rights are equally protected. And again, South Asia, unfortunately, is at the bottom quartile of that. There has been a lot of progress. So a lot of the law has been becoming much more gender blind, but there's still quite a bit space to move there. And then from this year, 2024, for the first time, they measure not just the de jure, what are the laws on the books, but also the de facto. What are the laws? What is the implementation of the laws? Think of an example, as I mentioned, the mobility, right? So even if both men and women have a right to have a passport to travel internationally, that's the jure. But then if you, to implement that, the jure right, you need, say, to go into an office, and when you do the application for this passport, there is a little remaining part that is a consenting husband signature. Then obviously, if the husband doesn't go and accompany the wife, she can't get in a passport. So that implementation has been for the first time measured this year in not all the countries, but for a quite large number. And we also use that and show that in South Asia also the implementation is there is some space to improve. And finally, we connect that implementation gap to social norms. And what we find is that when social norms are more restrictive, the implementation gap is larger. So what that means is that while you can have good intention and you can pass good laws which protect the rights of women, if society is not ready in some ways, they find a way to dodge the laws on the book, and so the implementation is lacking. So you have to work a little bit on both fronts. Sometimes it's important to pass law. Passing law gives a signal that the society is ready to move on, but there is still work to be done at the micro level, on the education level, or on things that are sometimes not discussed enough. And so there's a little bit of, in the last 10 years or so, literature on what is called edutainment. So there is an interesting paper in Brazil, a soap opera that shows figures of women that are not just good wives and good mothers, but they are successful professionals. And there has been measurement that this soap opera has been broadcast in Brazil at different times. So they were able to identify the causal effect and of exposure to these cultural models, and they have an effect on fertility, on female labor force situation in Brazil. So there's literature there. There's an interesting paper, I may have mentioned this already last time we talked, on Saudi Arabia, of men that are asked what do they think their peers think of their wives going to work, and what they personally think. And there is a gap there. So people are asked, when they are asked, what do you think your wife should work? They say, yes, of course, But then when they are asked, what do you think your peers think of your wife working? No, my peers wouldn't like that. But then when this is corrected and they say to a group of people, no, look, your peers think like you. It's not that they think badly if your wife works. They say this to a group and not to another group, so they have a treated and a control group. And the treated group that knows that, in fact, the society is not so conservative, their women start working or applying for jobs or even apply for a driving license. So there is a lot of things that when I discuss this with my colleagues, macroeconomists, or even with ministers, etc., we can't do anything with culture. It's too, and also sometimes they don't even like a Washington consensus to tell them what to think, what their values are, etc. But it's not like that. It's just that there are things that are not discussed at times. Then we can begin a conversation, and things can move.
Also, that sometimes the law can shape social norms.
Indeed, yeah. Yes. The relationship goes both ways. So there's one clear example is the fast progress on equality of marriage for heterosexual and homosexual couples in the U.S. This, as a few years back, was an inconceivable thing, and because of in the 80s, there's a paper that provides this hypothesis because of AIDS, and people had to declare their preference more openly. Society realized that there is a difference in preferences, and so there has been a very quick equalization of rights there, and the laws has implemented that very quickly. So norms there changed and the laws followed. There are other examples where for thousands of years in China, foot binding, the fact that women were forced to wear tiny shoes mainly to control their mobility. It was 1,000 years there. A few decided, no, this has to change, and in less than 20 years, basically, has gone away. So there was more an institutional mechanism that changed the norm. So it goes both ways in a way.
On the laws for female, incidentally, Advocata basically has done a project called Freedom for Her.
Yes.
Which was really identifying gaps in the law. And on many areas, there are some issues in the labor law, basically, that they cannot work after, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock.
Right,
And there are
right.
issues in the hospitality industry. If you're a waitress, people here eat dinner late, so you can't leave at a particular time.
Mm-hmm.
But interestingly, on the social norms, you use some USAID data, right? Sri Lanka was missing.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be interesting if that was expanded to cover Sri Lanka to understand what the social norms here are.
Yes.
Because here we have been fairly less conservative as far as women are concerned. You have a lot of women who are holding top positions in companies, in senior management.
Mm-hmm.
We've had also political leaders. Some of them, of course, have been spouses or daughters of politicians, but our more recent prime minister has come to be the prime minister on her own merit. So I would think Sri Lanka is less conservative as far as women's role is concerned in economic activity. But there was another couple of interesting things in your study about the marriage penalty and the child penalty. Because when I was looking at this, Maurizio, in Sri Lanka, one author had speculated about the demographics in our country. So we are like, median age is about 33. And that author was speculating that this is like the peak childbearing age, child rearing age. Because here people get are married a little bit older. In some parts of the country, they get married younger, and this author was speculating that it may be that there is a demographic transition issue here, that when the average age or median age starts increasing, many of these women may come back into the labor force. So why don't you tell us about this marriage penalty and child penalty?
Sure. Okay. So let me say that on the data first, the measuring social norm, as I said earlier, it's in its infancy. It's a complicated issue because you have to overcome this so-called social acceptability bias. When you ask people what do they think about certain values, they tend to figure out what the interviewer values are and try to be in sync with that to please it. So it's not easy. There are ways of doing that. We use several types of data sources, including a survey which we did with Facebook, which has other issues because it's only people with internet connection. So there are certain other biases. We have also developed our own survey instrument, questionnaire that we have used in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. It would be great to come and apply that survey also in Sri Lanka. So we could talk about that if we find the funding. It would be great to run it here, etc. And I agree with you that potentially Sri Lanka has a less restrictive set of norms for women working out, possibly because of this role model that of women in good position is an important factor. So, but going to your question about the marriage penalty, okay, so the basic story starts from the fact that gender equality has improved quite a lot in the world, but a pain point remains that when women give birth and their attachment to the labor market becomes weaker, and they either stop temporarily to work, and when they enter back the work, they have hard time to recuperate the time lost while they were rearing their child. So that's the child penalty. So it's something that men don't have in their labor history, in their biography of work, where women have paid that child penalty, which is significant, especially if you think that it has implication even for later stages of life for pension, because you have accumulated less pension. So it's a serious penalty. And up to now, till recently, it wasn't even thought about this, but it was the whole thing was literally linked to having a child. The child penalty was called. What we did is follow some new papers that look at the fact that even women that marry but don't have children immediately, there is a marriage penalty. And that's what we have been able to measure for the whole region, and it's significant, and it's about about 12 percentage points. So women who marry and don't have child immediately, don't rear kids, have on average 12 percentage point less participation in the labor market. So what could be the reasons for that is are potentially mainly one that is signaling to the men or the husband or their households, it could be also even the in-laws, that they are ready to work at home. And so they signal, oh, I retreat from the labor market, I'm ready to take care of my husband, take care of our households, I will specialize in homemaking while my spouse will specialize in breadwinning. And that is a powerful signal, and that is the rationalization for this additional penalty that comes on top of the child penalty, or when these women have children, they don't necessarily lower their participation because they have already kind of retreated from the labor market. So that's what we have been able to measure with DHS data, the Demographic and Health Survey data, which is available for most countries in South Asia. Yeah.
And finally, Maurizio, in the report you have two spotlights. We discussed about remittances, but there is also a spotlight on climate change.
Yes.
And you are today in Sri Lanka, but the rain that we are experiencing, this is very uncharacteristic at this time of the year. We also have extreme heat in March and April. So the report talks about the problem of extreme heat and floods in South Asia.
Right.
Could you just touch on that?
Sure. So again, this is also part of our ongoing work on climate risk and climate adaptation in the region, which is the whole World Bank group is much more focused on this and sees this as a structural important issue for the next future, near and long term. So we have been doing, before this piece, we have been doing quite a bit of literature review on how we can support adaptation in the region. So we had a piece last 6 months ago on this. The piece you're referring to for this report is more on the distributional impact of climate shocks. So there are two. We look at two types of shock, as you mentioned. One being exposure to extreme heat, and the other exposure to flooding. And in terms of distribution, we look also at two things. One is vulnerability, so how exposed you are to such a shock, and capacity to respond to that shock. When you are really vulnerable and have little wiggle room, a little buffer to withstand a shock, then the impact can be major. And so, in terms of heat, we observe, and in terms of flooding as well, we observe the first thing that we observe is that these episodes are becoming more and more frequent, both in terms of how often they happen, but also in terms of their intensity as they happen. And then we observe, okay, so is there a difference in exposure when you look at the income or wealth spectrum of the population? And what we find for heat is, indeed there is. And the people who are at the bottom of the distribution tend to be more exposed to intense temperature shocks, which has implication for health and productivity. And And in terms of flooding, there's a little bit of a distinction. Oh, by the way, the intensity of the distributional bias towards poor individuals is stronger in urban areas than rural areas for it. But in terms of the flood, what we found is that it's a little bit more nuanced, the message, and that is for non-recurrent flood, the richer individuals are more exposed. And that is potentially the rationalization of that is that because non-recurrent flood bring nutrients to the soil, so having
that's
some
in rural areas,
yes,
right?
correct. Having some of that means that you are in a zone where from time to time you get replenishment of nutrients, so it's that. But for chronic flooding and also in urban areas, it's the same as heat. So the poorer you are, the more exposed you are. And then there is this fact that the buffer that I was mentioning, since people who are poorer are more exposed, they have less savings, and the scars from such a shock have long-term implication because they have to either sell or the assets that they use for producing their livelihood, and so they have to restart from zero, or another recurrent type of scar is that children start not going to school because they have to contribute to getting the food for the house. So there is a human capital scar on children. So,
because if you look at the geography of Colombo City, the exposure to flooding, which is on the banks of our major rivers, there's a river called Calania, you generally find the poorer segments of the city living in those areas.
Right.
And invariably they get flooded.
Right.
And it is now happening more frequently.
Right.
And as you know, mitigating measures are very expensive. It requires a lot of civil engineering, which a country like Sri Lanka unfortunately has not prioritized.
Yeah, and it's complicated because you have to somehow make decisions about moving people out of certain places, right, that are exposed. But even a country like the US, if you look at Florida and the fact that they are being receiving more and more hurricanes, the insurance market is not working perfectly there because there is a lot of federal help to mitigate the insurance premium, and so people end up seeing a higher premium for their condos in Florida, but they're not as high as to persuade them to abandon this region. So then a hurricane comes and destroy a lot of capital. But it's a complicated thing to manage this one. But even in a rich country such as the U.S. So it is. We are putting more and more focus on these areas in the next few years of research as well.
So Maurizio, it's been a long conversation.
Indeed.
A lot of insights, and we hope that more policymakers in Sri Lanka read this valuable report. Thank you for visiting us in Advocata. Thank you for coming to Sri Lanka, and thank you for studying Sri Lanka.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.